Before we get started, hit the comments and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Whether you're catching sunrise in Nairobi, burning midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to hear from you. Don't just watch silently, let me know where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The neon sign flickered above the rusted anchor bar, casting fractured red and blue light across the worn wooden floor. Crowds chattered, laughter mixing with the clink of glasses. In the middle of the chaos, a single moment felt like it was moving in slow motion. A young Marine, broad-shouldered, with a freshly pressed uniform and a swagger that came from a mix of pride and nerves, shoved past the crowd. His elbow caught someone unexpectedly. "Watch it," a sharp voice snapped, cutting through the din. The Marine froze, looking down at the woman he'd just shoved. She was tall, imposing even without the uniform beneath her leather jacket, her hazel eyes flashing with controlled fury. Her hand steadied the edge of the bar as if she had just survived a storm. The Marine stumbled back, shock flickering across his face. He hadn't just bumped a stranger. He had knocked over her drink, leaving a red stain on her pristine jacket. The laughter from his friends at the corner of the room made him grin nervously. "Relax, it was an accident," he said, voice carrying a hint of bravado. The woman's gaze didn't waver. She didn't yell, she didn't curse. Instead, she took a measured breath, her jaw tightening, and in a voice that seemed calm but cut like steel, she said, "You owe me respect, Marine. And I always collect debts." A ripple of tension ran through the bar, as if everyone knew something unspoken had just shifted. The Marine laughed awkwardly, trying to mask the unease creeping up his spine. "Debts? Come on, it's just a drink. No harm done." She leaned closer, her presence magnetic and intimidating. The faint smell of her cologne mixed with the sharp tang of alcohol and cigarettes. "No harm done? That's not how you handle people in my world." The Marine's smile faltered. Something about her, the tilt of her chin, the certainty in her stance, made his chest tighten. He glanced at the name tag on his uniform, then back at her, expecting a common civilian. But there was nothing ordinary about her posture, her eyes, or the calm power radiating from her. Then it hit him like lightning splitting a dark sky. The insignia on her jacket, barely visible under the dim bar lights, glimmered with authority he hadn't expected. He squinted. "Wait, Admiral?" he breathed, the word almost lost in the crowd. She straightened fully, the weight of her rank undeniable. "Yes," she said softly, almost pityingly. "Admiral Taylor Varon. And you are exactly the kind of Marine I've been warning my officers about." The Marine swallowed hard, his pride shrinking under the sudden, crushing weight of realization. The bar, the laughter, the music, all of it seemed to fade into background noise. Every eye in the room felt drawn to the confrontation, yet no one moved. Then, before he could apologize, before he could even process the storm of emotions, she turned away. Her leather jacket swung with deliberate authority as she walked toward the back door, leaving him frozen, humiliated, and stunned. The door clicked shut behind her, and a silence fell over the bar that felt heavier than any disciplinary report or military court-martial he had faced. Somewhere in the distance, a jukebox played a lonely, sorrowful tune, but he couldn't hear it over the pounding of his own heartbeat. This was no ordinary Marine mistake. This was the beginning of a reckoning, a collision between pride and authority, between impulsive youth and hard-earned respect. And he knew, deep down, he had no idea how far the consequences of one small shove could reach. The city skyline blurred behind the speeding taxi, neon lights streaking across rain-slick streets. The Marine, Jackson Rourke, sat pressed against the seat, jaw clenched, replaying the incident in the rusted anchor bar. To him, it was just another night out, a break from drills, paperwork, and the relentless weight of being a Marine trying to prove himself. But this woman, this Admiral, had shattered the thin armor of his confidence. Jackson hadn't always been the brash Marine who bumped strangers in bars. Born in a small industrial town in Pennsylvania, he had grown up learning that toughness and a loud voice were survival tools. His father, a retired Navy officer, had drilled into him discipline and pride, yet the boy had inherited the kind of impatience that made him stumble over authority. Every promotion, every commendation had been a battle to prove he deserved the uniform, the stripes, the respect. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in a controlled, orderly Pentagon office, Taylor Varon was reviewing mission logs with an intensity that could ignite steel. She had risen through ranks in a world that had always doubted her, constantly being tested, judged, and sometimes underestimated because of her unconventional approach and the faintly rebellious streak that refused to bow to tradition. The years of tactical planning, sleepless nights, and impossible decisions had forged her into a leader who demanded precision and respect, yet she had a quiet compassion for the troops who earned her trust. It was that combination, fierce discipline and rare empathy, that made her infamous among both admirals and subordinates. To her, Marines were more than ranks. They were humans, each with flaws and untapped potential. She had seen countless young men and women make mistakes that could cost lives, and she never tolerated arrogance or carelessness. Back in the bar, Jackson's memory flickered. Earlier that evening he had joked with friends about flirting with confidence, about showing the world he belonged. He didn't expect that confidence to collide with authority in human form, standing tall, commanding attention without even trying. The slight push, a gesture he considered harmless, had drawn an instantaneous wall of discipline in front of him, an invisible force that left him off balance. Tayla's flashback was quieter but no less vivid. She remembered the countless evenings she had walked into dim bars, hoping for anonymity after weeks of commanding troops, only to find herself recognized, judged, or underestimated. She had learned early that humility was armor, pride could be dangerous. Yet there was a strange, almost poetic justice in encountering someone like Jackson. Impulsive, brash, unaware. Someone whose lessons would have to be earned through consequences, not lectures. For Jackson, the humiliation cut deeper than any drill instructor's rebuke. He had always prided himself on control, on appearing competent. But in that instant he realized the weight of true authority, the kind that didn't need to raise a hand or yell, the kind that simply existed in posture, voice, and gaze. Tayla's calm fury had stripped him bare, leaving a raw vulnerability he had never felt before. And for Tayla, seeing Jackson stumble wasn't satisfaction. It was a reminder of how young Marines often underestimated the consequences of their actions. Her life had taught her that one small misstep could spiral into disaster, a lesson Jackson needed to learn before it was too late. Outside the bar, rain began to fall heavier, tapping against windows and rooftops, mirroring the storm of realization that now swirled in both of their lives. The collision wasn't just physical, it was a confrontation of experience versus arrogance, authority versus impulsive pride. And neither of them knew that this single moment, fleeting and chaotic, would ripple forward into something far bigger than either could imagine. The morning sun spilled over the naval base, glinting off steel and glass as Jackson Rourke marched with precision, though the memory of last night's humiliation lingered like a shadow. He kept his eyes forward, but his mind replayed Tayla Varen's steady, unyielding gaze. She had looked through him, not at his rank, not at his uniform, but at the raw flaws he carried like armor he thought was invisible. Jackson had risen quickly through the ranks, but his brashness often got the better of him. He had always believed confidence could mask mistakes, that a joke or a shove could smooth over any error. Now he understood differently. Authority wasn't just earned, it radiated, and Tayla had it in spades. She commanded without speaking, controlled without raising her voice. In the command center, Tayla moved among her officers like a force of nature. The hum of machinery, the glow of monitors, and the soft tapping of keyboards formed a rhythm she could almost dance to. Every report, every brief, every decision reflected the careful strategy she had cultivated over decades. Yet beneath the precision she sensed a ripple of disturbance. Someone new had entered the base last night, someone who carried the reckless energy that could disrupt order, or ignite it. Jackson arrived for his first briefing of the day, uniform pressed, boots shining, heart still racing from guilt and pride clashing inside him. He didn't expect her to be there. But there she was, standing at the head of the room, reviewing a tactical map, her posture sharp, every movement deliberate. When she turned, their eyes met, and the memory of the bar flashed like lightning. "Marine Rourke," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative, though she kept the slightest hint of controlled amusement. "You've made quite an impression in less than 24 hours. The room fell silent, officers exchanging glances as whispers brushed against the edges of the tense air. Jackson's pride recoiled, and for the first time he felt completely exposed. "Yes, Admiral," he replied, words tight in his throat. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words seemed too small, too fragile against the force of her presence. Tayla's eyes didn't waver. She scanned him from head to toe, noting posture, hesitation, and a flicker of vulnerability in the young Marine's gaze. Their first official interaction was brief. Orders were given, maps analyzed, and mission priorities outlined. Jackson tried to focus on the tactical details, but his mind kept circling the bar, the push, the spilled drink, the way she had turned authority into a silent weapon. He felt small, yet the awareness also sparked something new: respect and fear. in equal measure. Later, in a quiet corridor, Jackson caught her alone for a fleeting moment. "Admiral Varen," he began, voice steadier than he felt. I about last night?" "Marine," she interrupted softly but firmly, "consider it a lesson in awareness. Not just of your surroundings but of the consequences of your actions. Remember that." Her gaze softened for a brief second, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to make him realize this wasn't about punishment. It was about preparation, survival, leadership. Jackson nodded, swallowing hard. He wasn't used to authority tempered with insight. Most leaders barked orders or demanded respect. They rarely made you understand why. And in that understanding he felt the stirrings of something dangerous, admiration mixed with self-reproach. Outside, the wind rattled metal shutters and carried the scent of the nearby sea, sharp and briny. Jackson knew the Admiral's lesson wouldn't end in the hallways or the bar. It would extend into missions, decisions, and moments where life and death hung in delicate balance. For Taylor, the young Marine was a puzzle piece she couldn't ignore. Impulsive, reckless, full of raw talent that needed shaping, or it could destroy him, or worse, others. She made a mental note to watch him closely. Lessons weren't always easy, and sometimes humiliation was only the beginning of understanding. Their paths were entwined now, whether they realized it or not, and the collision from last night was just the spark that would ignite a fire neither of them could anticipate. The base hummed with activity as dawn broke over the ocean, washing the hangars and training fields in pale gold. Jackson Rourke moved through the ranks, the weight of his uniform heavy not from fabric but from the memory of last night and the looming presence of Admiral Taylor Varen. He had trained for months to master drills and protocols, but no exercise had prepared him for the collision of ego, authority, and respect he now faced. Taylor, meanwhile, stood on the observation deck overlooking the bay. The wind tugged at her jacket, whipping loose strands of hair across her stern features. She studied the incoming ships and personnel with sharp eyes, noting efficiency, timing, and discipline. Yet, her thoughts kept returning to the young Marine who had pushed through a bar door without realizing he was stepping into the orbit of someone who carried years of hard-won authority in every movement. Back in the barracks, Jackson tried to focus on his routines, but every glance, every step, reminded him of how small a misstep could feel under her gaze. He remembered the bar, the spilled drink, the shove, the silence afterward. Even now, it burned like a lesson branded into his chest. He couldn't shake the sense that their encounter was more than chance. It was a warning, one that demanded awareness and growth, or risk humiliation again, in a way far less forgiving than spilled alcohol. Taylor's reputation for turning chaos into order preceded her, and whispers of her rigorous standards echoed through the corridors. Officers and recruits alike spoke cautiously, but Jackson's presence, energetic, untamed, and untested, was a quiet tremor in her well-structured world. She understood potential when she saw it, even if it came wrapped in impulsive arrogance. Jackson could rise, or falter spectacularly. Later that afternoon, the first signs of tension surfaced during tactical exercises on the training grounds. Jackson led a small team through a simulated urban assault, energy high, confidence soaring, but missteps appeared instantly. A corner was missed, a command delayed, and his teammates faltered. From the observation tower, Taylor's eyes narrowed. She didn't intervene immediately, the lesson had to land naturally. Mistakes would teach more than instructions ever could. "Marine Rourke," she called finally, her voice cutting through the radio chatter like a blade. "Report to the command tent immediately." Alone. The walk across the wet grass was heavy for Jackson. Rain from the early morning had left puddles, reflecting the gray sky and the tension coiling in his chest. Every step brought him closer to a reckoning he didn't yet understand fully, but could feel in his stomach. Inside the tent, Taylor stood waiting, maps and mission reports scattered around her. Her expression was calm, yet there was an edge to her posture, a subtle authority that demanded honesty. "Mistakes happen," she began, her voice steady. "But repeated errors under pressure endanger lives. Yours, your team's, and everyone depending on them." Jackson swallowed, nodding. He wanted to argue, to explain, but no words seemed adequate. She wasn't just reprimanding him. She was revealing a truth he had avoided. Discipline wasn't about pride, it was about survival, about integrity, about being ready when everything went wrong. Taylor stepped closer, and for a brief moment, her commanding presence softened. "You have skill, Marine, but skill alone doesn't make a leader. Respect, observation, and restraint do. Fail to cultivate them, and the consequences are yours to bear." The words sank deep into Jackson's chest, heavier than any drill, sharper than any criticism. He realized the bar incident, the shove, even his youthful arrogance. It was all preparation for a larger battlefield. And for the first time he felt the stirrings of genuine respect, tinged with fear, for a woman whose authority eclipsed his bravado. Outside the tent, the rain had stopped, leaving the training grounds glistening, a mirror of challenge and opportunity. Jackson understood something fundamental. If he survived Taylor's lessons, he could rise far beyond his current limitations. If he failed, he would face humiliation not in a bar, but under the watchful eyes of a force that demanded perfection. And somewhere deep inside both of them knew, the collision of their paths was just beginning. What started as a shove in a bar was becoming a journey neither could escape, a test of courage, skill and character that would define both of their fates. Dawn broke with a steel-gray sky over the remote coastal training grounds, waves crashing against jagged rocks below. Jackson's boots crunched against gravel as he approached the landing zone, tension coiling in his chest like a spring. Today wasn't a drill. It was a simulated rescue mission, a high-stakes test designed by Taylor to push Marines to the edge of instinct, skill and composure. Taylor stood at the observation deck, her leather jacket pulled tight against the cold wind. Her hazel eyes scanned the team with precision, noting hesitation, courage and mistakes before they even happened. She didn't shout, she didn't gesture, she merely existed as a force of judgment and expectation. Every Marine under her gaze felt it. Jackson felt it more keenly than anyone. Team Alpha, positions, she called into the comms, her voice calm yet commanding, cutting through the roar of the surf below. Jackson Rourke, lead point. Eyes open. Fail, and the consequences aren't simulated. Jackson swallowed hard. Lead point meant responsibility, the first to enter, the first to react, the first to protect everyone else. He gritted his teeth and forced his adrenaline into focus. His team looked to him, trust mixed with uncertainty, waiting for a steady hand he wasn't sure he could provide. The mission began. Fog rolled across the cliffs, wet rock slicked beneath boots. Shadows shifted in the mist like predators lying in wait. Jackson's mind flashed to Taylor's words from the tent. Respect, observation and restraint. He forced himself to slow his breathing, scan each angle and communicate clearly. A false move could mean failure, or worse, injury. A misstep sent a teammate stumbling, nearly slipping over a jagged edge. Jackson lunged, steadying him, heart pounding. The voice of Taylor echoed in his memory, consequences are yours to bear. The climax of the mission approached, a simulated hostage trapped in a crumbling structure at the cliff's edge. Jackson assessed the situation, his fingers trembling as he adjusted his comms. His instinct screamed to charge, to act alone, but he remembered Taylor's unyielding eyes, the weight of authority, the lesson in restraint. He breathed, coordinated, and led the team with precision, every move deliberate. From the observation deck, Taylor's expression remained unreadable. She noted the Marine's hesitation, the flicker of doubt in his movements, but also the correction, the learning, the growth in real time. She had seen raw potential turn into action under pressure, and this was one of those rare moments where a Marine either rose, or broke. Jackson and his team reached the simulated hostage, securing them without casualty. Relief hit him like a wave, but he didn't exhale fully. There was still Taylor, still the weight of her gaze, still the knowledge that this was only the beginning. As they returned to base, the fog lifted slightly, sunlight cutting through the gray haze. Jackson, drenched in sweat and mud, felt the shift inside him. He had survived, yes, but more importantly he had learned. Respect wasn't just about obedience, it was about awareness, control, and the courage to restrain instinct when necessary. Later, Taylor met him at the edge of the training ground. Her stance was calm, commanding, and for the first time Jackson caught the faintest hint of approval in her eyes. You executed well, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mistakes will still happen, but today you led rather than reacted. Remember that moment? It's the difference between surviving and failing. Jackson nodded, chest heavy with exhaustion, pride, and a budding respect that mingled uneasily with lingering fear. He had faced humiliation, authority, and danger, all in 1 week, and survived. But he knew the real test was yet to come. Missions that wouldn't be simulations, consequences that would be real, and lessons Taylor would continue to teach, whether he liked them or not. Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and wet stone, a reminder that every challenge, every collision, and every choice existed in a world larger than themselves. Jackson realized their paths were no longer parallel. They had collided, intertwined, and would move forward together through fire, storms, and the unforgiving tests of both life and leadership. Night had fallen over the base, and the faint glow of floodlights cast long shadows across the training grounds. Jackson sat alone on the edge of the helipad, boots dangling, helmet beside him. His uniform was stained with sweat, mud, and the remnants of the day's exercise. Every muscle ached, yet the ache in his chest was different. A quiet, gnawing tension that came from knowing he was being shaped into something far beyond his own understanding. He replayed the day over and over. The simulated hostage, the fog, the edge of the cliff. It was more than a test of skill. It was a test of self-control, decision-making, and humility. And every time he remembered Taylor's gaze, sharp and unwavering, he felt a sting of fear and awe he couldn't shake. She had seen every flaw, every hesitation, every crack in his confidence, and yet she hadn't humiliated him. Not yet. Meanwhile, inside the base, Taylor stood by the window of her private office, looking out over the dark ocean. The waves whispered secrets, crashing against jagged rocks, a rhythm that reminded her of all the Marines she had trained and lost. Behind her calm exterior, memories gnawed, mistakes that had cost lives, misjudgments she had made in the fog of war, the weight of leadership that never slept. Jackson was impulsive, reckless, and yet, he reminded her of herself at that age, hungry, defiant, unshaped by responsibility. A sudden alert on her console pulled her from her reverie. An unplanned exercise report flagged Jackson's team, highlighting minor mistakes under stress. She frowned, not out of anger but concern. He was talented, yes, but untempered. Leadership was more than executing orders. It was carrying the burden of others' lives without letting ego or fear interfere. She needed him ready, and fast. Later, Jackson's bunkmate nudged him awake from restless pacing. "You okay?" he asked, noticing the haunted look in Jackson's eyes. Jackson shook his head, voice low. "It's Taylor, she's different. She doesn't just command, you feel everything you do under her like it matters, in a way that scares me." His bunkmate nodded, understanding more than words could convey. "That's respect," he said simply. "And fear. Both will teach you more than any drill ever could." Jackson stared at the ceiling, thinking of the bar, the shove, the spilled drink, and Taylor's quiet, lethal authority. Everything he had known about leadership, pride, and control was being rewritten. And with every lesson he felt both exhilarated and terrified. The next morning brought another challenge. Jackson and his team were sent to navigate a dense urban training course at dawn, the streets slick with early rain. Visibility was low, the terrain unpredictable, and tension thick enough to taste. Taylor observed from a drone console, her voice coming through comms only when absolutely necessary. "Focus, Marine," she instructed, calm yet sharp. One mistake could compromise the entire operation. As Jackson led his team through narrow alleys, avoiding simulated ambushes and hazards, he felt the pressure mounting. Panic threatened to creep in, but he remembered Taylor's words from the helipad. "Carry the weight, don't let it carry you." Every decision, every breath, became deliberate. Mistakes still happened, but he adapted, recalibrated, and guided his team forward. Afterward, he stood alone again, rain dripping from his hair, uniform soaked, heart hammering. For the first time, he understood that Taylor's presence was not punishment, it was preparation. Leadership was terrifying, lonely, and relentless. But under her guidance, he could survive, grow, and maybe even earn a fraction of the respect she commanded effortlessly. And Taylor, watching him from her office window, allowed herself the smallest acknowledgement, a quiet nod to a Marine who might, just might, rise to meet the standard she demanded. The collision of their paths was no longer accidental. It was purposeful, shaping both of their futures in ways neither could yet predict. The wind howled across the rugged cliffs at the outskirts of the base, carrying the sharp scent of salt and wet stone. Jackson crouched behind a rusted shipping container, rain slicking his uniform to his skin. The simulation had turned real, an unplanned infiltration exercise designed to test Marines under extreme conditions. Only this time something felt off. Orders were conflicting, and whispers through the comms hinted at mistakes from within the team. Taylor watched from a distance, perched in the observation tower, the storm and darkness reflecting off her calm, piercing gaze. She had noticed the irregularities before anyone else, the hesitation, the missteps, the subtle signals that not all errors were accidental. She had trained for situations like this, yet even she felt the tension twist in her gut. There was more at play than skill deficits. A breach of trust threatened to unravel the mission. Jackson's heart pounded. He had trained for ambushes, for hostile terrain, for the chaos of combat, but betrayal within your own team? That was a test he hadn't expected. He peered around the container, spotting Private Langley, his closest ally during training, frozen with indecision. A subtle glance, a hesitation, and Jackson realized Langley had ignored a direct order, a move that could cost lives. He clenched his fist, struggling to process. Was it fear, incompetence, or something more sinister? The simulation demanded he act decisively. Hesitation could mean failure, injury, even death. Every lesson Taylor had drilled into him, restraint, observation, respect, now collided with raw instinct. He had to choose, act aggressively and risk harming his teammate, or maintain control and hope trust could prevail. From above, Taylor's voice cut through the storm via comms, calm but commanding. Jackson assessed the threat. Lead with clarity, not impulse. Remember, a Marine's judgment defines outcomes, not just bravery. Her words weren't just guidance, they were a lifeline. Jackson took a steadying breath, recalling every lesson from the bar, the helipad, and the urban course. He moved, precise, commanding, signaling Langley without accusation. They maneuvered together, avoiding hazards, securing their objective. Jackson's pulse raced, sweat and rain mixing, but the mission survived. The betrayal, or whatever had threatened them, was contained, but the lesson was undeniable. Trust could fracture under pressure, and leadership demanded more than skill. Later, in the debriefing room, tension crackled like static electricity. Officers exchanged glances, murmuring quietly, yet Taylor remained unflinching. Jackson stood before her, drenched and exhausted, and finally understood the gravity of accountability. Mistakes weren't just personal, they could imperil everyone under his command. Leadership isn't a title, Taylor said quietly, yet the room hung on her every word. It's the courage to face uncertainty, to recognize betrayal, to act decisively when failure isn't an option. Today you learned that. Not perfectly, but enough to survive next time. Jackson swallowed hard, chest tight. Respect for Taylor had deepened beyond fear or admiration. It had become understanding. Authority wasn't about being untouchable, it was about seeing clearly, acting decisively, and carrying responsibility heavier than any uniform could hold. As he left the debriefing, Jackson caught Taylor's eyes one last time. There was no smile, no softening, yet in that silent exchange, something shifted. She saw his potential raw but real. He saw her humanity hidden beneath steel and authority. Outside, the storm subsided, leaving puddles that mirrored dark clouds breaking into dawn. Jackson realized that danger, betrayal, and fear weren't obstacles, they were the crucible shaping him. And Taylor, relentless as the sea wind, had become both his challenge and his guide. The collision of their lives had moved from accidental to inevitable, and neither could predict how far it would carry them, or how deeply it would change them both. The base was quiet, save for the low hum of generators and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Jackson sat alone in the mess hall, staring at a nearly empty cup of coffee. Fatigue gnawed at him, but it wasn't just physical. The past weeks, every push, every reprimand, every life-or-death exercise, had begun to unravel the certainty he once carried. The collision with Admiral Taylor Varen had changed him, but not in ways he fully understood. Memories of the bar flashed unbidden. The shove. The spilled drink. The calm, cutting authority in her eyes. At first he had seen it as humiliation, then discipline, and now, a mirror. A mirror showing every flaw, every impulsive instinct he had tried to hide beneath pride. He realized that surviving her lessons required more than skill, it demanded confronting himself. Taylor, meanwhile, moved through her private quarters, reviewing mission reports with meticulous care. No one was around, and for the first time in weeks, her posture softened. She had built walls around herself to bear the weight of command, walls that kept her grief, fear, and doubt locked away. Yet, Jackson's persistence, his raw honesty and mistakes, chipped at those walls in ways she hadn't expected. He reminded her of the soldiers she had lost in past missions, of the young men and women she had failed to protect. His vulnerability stirred something long buried, empathy tempered by discipline, hope tempered by realism. Later that evening, a sudden comms alert summoned Jackson to the operations center. A real mission had come in, a coastal rescue of stranded civilians after a storm surge. The stakes were real now, not simulations. Jackson felt the familiar surge of fear and adrenaline. He glanced at Taylor as she stood by the planning table, her calm presence anchoring the chaos. "You're leading the insertion team," she said quietly, yet every word carried the weight of expectation. "This isn't practice. Lives depend on your judgment." The storm outside mirrored the tension inside Jackson. As he briefed his team, he noticed subtle signs of hesitation, doubt, even fear. He took a deep breath and recalled the lessons Taylor had pressed into him. Control over fear, restraint under chaos, clarity amid uncertainty. He delivered orders with measured authority, feeling the first real trace of confidence he had earned rather than assumed. During the insertion, visibility was nearly zero, waves crashed with ferocious power, and debris littered the shoreline. Jackson's heart raced, but every decision was deliberate. Each command saved seconds, each movement preserved life. For the first time he truly understood the gravity of leadership, not the pride of rank, not the thrill of heroics, but the quiet, relentless responsibility to guide, protect, and endure. After the civilians were secured, Jackson watched the storm recede. Mud and salt caked his uniform, fatigue weighing down every muscle, yet he felt an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. Taylor approached silently, her eyes meeting his. There was no praise, no lecture, just recognition. That single, silent acknowledgement spoke volumes. He had grown, yet the journey wasn't complete. Later, alone on the cliff edge, Jackson allowed himself a moment to breathe. The wind carried the salt and the scent of rain, and in that quiet, he felt the collision of fear, pride, and respect settle into something new, resolve. He understood that Taylor's authority, once terrifying, was now a guidepost, a force that would shape him into the Marine he was meant to become. Taylor, watching from afar, allowed herself the smallest exhale. For weeks she had tested him, pushed him, observed him. Now she glimpsed potential forged not by punishment but by understanding, not by fear alone, but by choice and responsibility. The storm had passed, but the collision between them was far from over. Each had changed, each had grown, and the stakes ahead, missions, trust, and perhaps something more personal, were now deeper, sharper, and impossibly real. The sky was a roiling gray, heavy with rain as Jackson's team approached the derelict warehouse on the outskirts of the port city. Intel had confirmed hostiles were holding civilians inside. A real-world scenario, not a simulation. Every nerve in Jackson's body screamed urgency, yet every lesson Taylor had drilled into him demanded patience, precision, and control. He glanced at her from the observation post across the street. Her eyes, sharp as steel, met his through the scope of the binoculars. There was no room for error. The streets were slick, puddles reflecting broken streetlights, the smell of wet asphalt mixing with smoke from distant fires. Jackson crouched, signaling his team silently. Hesitation was lethal. Every misstep could cost lives, yet he felt the crushing weight of responsibility for the first time in his career. He realized the shove in the bar, the failed drills, the storm training, they had all led to this moment. Inside the warehouse, civilians huddled in corners, fear etched across their faces. The hostiles were armed, unpredictable, moving like shadows among crates and steel beams. Jackson's heart pounded, but he breathed through the fear, recalling Taylor's guidance. Leadership isn't about acting first, it's about choosing correctly under pressure. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Sparks flew, shouts pierced the storm, and chaos threatened to engulf everything. Jackson reacted swiftly, guiding his team, shielding civilians, and moving with a mixture of instinct and hard-earned restraint. One wrong move could have killed them all. He realized with sharp clarity how much he had grown, the balance of courage and control, the fusion of respect for authority and personal initiative. Taylor watched from the observation post, tension tightening her chest. She had trained countless Marines, but Jackson's growth under extreme pressure was undeniable. Yet there was one unknown variable: his ability to make split-second moral decisions when no one could guide him. She held her breath as he navigated the chaos, each decision a test of instinct, intellect, and integrity. Minutes stretched like hours. Jackson moved through the smoke and rain, shouting commands, correcting mistakes, and saving civilians from harm. Private Langley, who had faltered during the earlier exercise, now followed Jackson's lead with renewed focus, evidence of the influence he had begun to exert. Trust had been forged under fire. Finally, Jackson reached the last hostage, a young child clinging to fear. A hostile combatant charged, weapon raised. Jackson's reflexes and judgment collided perfectly. He disarmed the threat, protected the child, and ensured his team secured the perimeter. Exhaustion slammed into him, but triumph and relief surged stronger. Lives were saved. The mission was a success. Taylor descended from the observation post, boots heavy on wet concrete. She approached Jackson, dripping rain from her jacket, eyes scanning him with a mixture of respect and unspoken approval. "You did well," she said simply, but the weight behind her words resonated more than any praise he had ever received. Jackson, chest heaving, mud-streaked and soaked, met her gaze. Humility, pride, relief, and admiration swirled together in a moment of raw truth. For the first time he understood what leadership, courage, and trust truly meant, Not just following orders, not just acting bravely, but carrying the lives of others on your decisions, your restraint, and your heart. They stood there in silence, the storm fading, puddles reflecting the first light of dawn. The collision of their worlds, impulsive youth and unyielding authority, had forged something powerful: respect, growth, and the beginning of a bond neither had anticipated but both needed. And as the city awoke and the rescued civilians were taken to safety, Jackson realized he had not only survived Taylor's trials, he had risen because of them. The stage was set. The final chapter would bring resolution, justice, and closure, not just for the mission, but for the journey that had begun with a simple shove in a bar. The base was quiet the morning after the mission. Dawn's first light cut across the training grounds, illuminating puddles that mirrored the sky and the calm after the storm. Jackson Rourke stood at attention, uniform still damp, boots muddied, and chest heaving from exhaustion. But this time, the weight he felt was not panic or fear. It was understanding, responsibility, growth. Admiral Taylor Varon approached, leather jacket damp, hair plastered to her face from the lingering storm. Her steps were deliberate, each one carrying authority tempered with unspoken pride. She stopped in front of Jackson, eyes scanning him, noting the difference between the Marine who had shoved her in a bar and the one who now stood firm, capable, tempered by every trial, every lesson. "Marine Rourke," she began, voice calm, unwavering, yet soft enough to carry the weight of recognition. "You've faced fear, chaos, and betrayal. You've led under fire, protected lives, and learned restraint. Today you earned the respect you sought without even realizing it." Jackson swallowed hard, pride and humility mixing in a tight knot in his chest. "Thank you, Admiral," he said quietly. For the first time the words felt sufficient, not empty, not forced, but real. Taylor's gaze softened, just slightly. "It's more than thanks. It's understanding that leadership is earned every day. That courage without control is dangerous, but courage with clarity can save lives." She paused, letting the lesson sink deep. "I see potential in you, Jackson. Potential that was hidden beneath recklessness, now emerging as strength." Jackson's mind flashed back. The shove in the bar, the spilled drink, the humiliation, the relentless training, the storm exercises, the betrayal in the ranks, and finally the coastal rescue. Every collision, every challenge, every moment of doubt had led here. He realized that Taylor had not just tested him, she had sculpted him into someone worthy of her command, someone capable of leading with both heart and mind. "Admiral," he said again, voice firmer this time, "I won't waste this opportunity. I'll carry the lessons, every day in every decision. I won't forget." Taylor nodded, a rare, faint smile touching her lips. "Good. Then you're ready, not just for missions but for everything that comes with being a Marine who matters. You've been pushed, challenged, and almost broken. But you didn't break. You grew." For the first time, Jackson felt the collision between them shift from confrontation to respect, from fear to understanding. What had begun as a mistake, a shove in a crowded bar, had become a journey of fire, discipline, and trust. They had tested each other, challenged each other, and emerged changed, stronger, sharper, and ready for whatever came next. As they walked across the training grounds together, the storm clouds dispersed, revealing a clear sky streaked with gold. Marines moved about, preparing for the day, unaware of the silent victory unfolding between the young Marine and the Admiral who had reshaped him. Jackson glanced at Taylor, finally seeing her not just as an intimidating authority, but as a mentor, a guide, and a leader whose lessons extended beyond orders and drills. Taylor, in turn, allowed herself a rare acknowledgement, pride in someone who had learned to respect authority, fear, and responsibility, and had emerged stronger for it. The collision that had begun with a bar, a shove, and a spilled drink had reached resolution. Lessons had been learned, respect had been earned, and both Marine and Admiral had grown in ways neither could have anticipated. And in that quiet morning light, with the sea breeze carrying salt and promise, Jackson Rourke knew he had not only survived Taylor Varon's trials. He had become the Marine he was meant to be, ready for any challenge, any mission, and any future that awaited. The story ended not with humiliation or defeat, but with justice, growth, and the unspoken bond forged in fire, storm, and unwavering authority.